What is voter fraud and why is it such a huge problem? Well, voter fraud is exactly what it sounds like. Illegal voting by impersonating another voter, voting more than once, or tampering with ballots or registration forms. If it were ever done with enough coordination across multiple counties and states, it could even result in a stolen presidential election. That sounds like a really serious threat, which is why it's a felony crime that is punishable by 5 years in prison and fines of up to $10,000. Really serious punishment. So, how many people are committing voter fraud? Well, in the last election, it was 0.0000001% of ballots cast. That's basically almost zero. But wait, weren't some people actually charged with voter fraud in the 2020 election? How many? 16 people out of 159 million votes cast. So if only 16 people out of 159 million voters were charged with voter fraud during the highest voter turnout in United States history, then why are so many people talking about it? To answer this, we have to go back in time to the 1800s and places like New York City where voter fraud was rampant. Back then, one didn't vote by going to their local schoolhouse or community center to line up and cast their ballot in a booth. Instead, they meaning wealthy white guys, went to a large public gathering, kind of like a party, where in between drinks, they would just yell out who they were voting for. As you can imagine, this really fun way of voting was taken advantage of. Votes were switched, people would be intimidated into voting a certain way because there was no privacy. And it was easy to pretend to be multiple voters. Stuff like guys changing their clothes and shaving their beards to look like a different person so they could cast a second vote really did happen. To fix this corruption, states started switching to a system using paper ballots and private voting booths, which is a predecessor of what we now use today. And just like that, voter fraud started to quickly disappear. With voter fraud practically gone, there wasn't a reason to talk about it anymore, right? Wrong. After the Civil War, Black men who had been enslaved by whites were granted the legal right to vote. So in 1865, for the very first time in American history, Black people could participate in democracy as long as they were a man. For the first time, Black candidates won elections in cities and states, and even in Congress. But these triumphs in the expansion of our democracy were met with vigilante violence. Thousands of Black Americans were lynched, assaulted, massacred. In addition to all of that, white racists sought to prevent Black men from voting. So they accused them of voter fraud. Fear of Black men voting fraudulently became a widespread hysteria. So in Birth of a Nation, one of the most popular silent films of the early 1900s, there's a scene of a guy in blackface committing voter fraud by voting twice. Imagery like this turned up the panic. The public loudly demanded laws be created to stop this heinous crime. And so, Black codes, or Jim Crow laws, were created to limit a wide scope of freedoms for African Americans and made it nearly impossible for Black men to vote at all. To make sure that these laws were obeyed, Black Americans were threatened with more violence. America witnessed a vast epidemic of racial hatred and deadly violence where a Black man or woman after the 19th Amendment passed faced many hurdles to vote, including the risk of death. Now, did these laws stop voter fraud? Well, no, because there wasn't really any voter fraud to begin with. They were really only passed and utilized because of their true purpose, maintaining white control of elections. These laws were so effective at shaping a white electorate that by 1910, registered voters among African Americans dropped to 15% in Virginia and under 2% in both Alabama and Mississippi. This meant that without fair representation in the government, Black Americans and their concerns were marginalized at best. So generations of possible wealth and opportunity for Black communities were effectively destroyed. Finally, in 1965, a full 100 years after the end of the American Civil War, the Voting Rights Act was passed. Championed by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the Voting Rights Act made racist voter suppression tactics illegal. Now, that must have been the end of using voter fraud as a boogeyman, right? No. Nope. it very much continued. Most notably after the 2000 election recount, when the administration of George W. Bush successfully used the idea of voter fraud to delegitimize as many of his opponents' ballots as possible. So Attorney General John Ashcroft promised the nation that in the future he would expose the vast problem of voter fraud and finally eliminate it once and for all. And what would become a pattern? Republican officials and lawmakers in states like Florida, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Washington made accusations of widespread abuse with no actual proof, ever. 5 years after the Bush administration began their, quote, crackdown on voter fraud, the Justice Department turned up virtually no evidence of voter fraud. Millions of tax dollars were wasted on this investigation that proved once and for all that voter fraud just does not exist on any kind of meaningful level. Case closed, right? Not so fast. Because a crucial thing happened that brought the ridiculous charge of voter fraud roaring back.
Voter registration cards have become the focus of fraud investigations in Nevada, Connecticut, Missouri.
What happened? Well, Barack Obama became the first Black president in United States history. He was also the first president ever elected who did not win the majority vote of white people.
The white establishment is now the minority.
Republicans and groups like the Koch-funded American Legislative Exchange Council suddenly became very interested in funding measures to make it harder for Americans, especially Black and brown Americans, to vote. And in 2013, the GOP finally got what they wanted. They gutted the Voting Rights Act. A partisan majority of the United States Supreme Court stripped the Voting Rights Act of key enforcement provisions that had protected voting rights for nearly 50 years. Voter suppression, like the purging of voter rolls for voters of color and voter fraud rhetoric, was back again. And it's still with us today.
Unprecedented allegations of voter fraud.
So the next time you hear voter fraud, you'll know that it is manufactured hysteria meant to pave the way for voter suppression. Voter fraud is more rare than being struck by lightning. And when it does happen, it's usually just a mistake by someone who thought they were legally voting. Because, and I cannot say this strongly enough, who would risk going to prison for 5 years just to vote a second time? Today, the voter fraud myth is more than just a blatantly racist voter suppression tactic. It's being used to undermine our collective faith in all elections. So next time you hear someone talk about voter fraud, share this video and demand that your friends and your family remain rooted in the facts. And the facts are that voter fraud is not a threat to our democracy. Making it harder for Americans to vote is the real threat to our democracy. Share this video and help us spread the truth.